Tēnā koutou e hoa mā, e mihi ana kia tātou kua hui hui mai I tēnei rā. No mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. E mihi ana kia koutou kua tae mai kia tautoko I te kaupapa. No airangi o kutupuna, ke Tūtaki aho e noho ana, he kaipupuri pūranga matahiko matua aho, ke te puna mataranga o Aotearoa aho e mahi ana, ko Valerie Love tōku ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So hello and good morning, everyone. I've just welcomed everyone here in Te Reo Māori and given a little bit of background about myself. My name is Valerie Love, and I'm one of the vice chairs of iPRES2025. Outside of iPRES, I'm Senior Digital Archivist at the National Library of New Zealand, where I've worked for the past 13 years. But lately, my job has been iPRES. It is my absolute privilege to be here to welcome you to Day 2 of iPRES 2025 in Te Whanganui Atara, Wellington, and online. In addition to being one of the conference vice chairs along with Jan Hutash and Marty Gengenbach, I've had the pleasure to serve as the iPRES Communications co-chair, along with the wonderful Angela Pugioni of the DPC, who basically gave me a crash course in comms this year. So you can now officially put a face to all of the emails you've received, the social media posts, the newsletters. Sorry if it was too much, but we like info, so we put it out there. I've really enjoyed getting to share our conference planning journey with all of you through the newsletters and the comms. It's been a lot of fun, and thank you to everybody who has contributed or proofread or been a part of that as well. We know that for many of you, this might be your first and only time in Aotearoa, so we really tried to bring as much of our culture to the conference as possible. We also wanted to ensure that we provided a platform for underrepresented voices within the digital preservation community, with a strong focus on Aotearoa New Zealand, Australia, and the Pacific, to share our local and regional context. And with that note, I'm going to pass over very quickly to my colleague Tapatu with a very brief announcement.
Kia ora tātou. Just a reminder that we have the Wellington Wanderer quiz, and so there's some amazing prizes, and I don't want to take them home, so I want to give them out to you. So make sure you get your entries in, and I think I will draw it maybe tomorrow at lunchtime. So you've got a day and a half to get your entries in so you can win some amazing prizes and also learn more about Wellington and different sites around Wellington. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thanks, Tapatu. Tapatu is our social chair. She is the one who makes things fun, and we are so grateful to her for bringing the fun. So I do have a few less fun housekeeping announcements, although they're not terrible, I promise. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, the golden rule is to follow the instructions of Tākina staff should anything out of the ordinary happen. If there is an earthquake, drop, cover, hold, stay inside. This building is incredibly safe. And the final announcement is just Q&As and Slido, so please do put your questions there. We do have a reminder from our program committee that there are a couple of awards that we need you to vote for. This year's Best Poster Award is sponsored by Infotel and is an Audience Choice Award. iPRES attendees, both in person and virtual, can vote for Best Poster during the conference, and again, that's for in-person and virtual posters. You'll hear more about our second Audience Choice Award tomorrow, which is for Lightning Talks, but both of these Audience Choice Awards do have a monetary prize, so please do vote. Pick your favorites, get your voices heard, and help showcase some of the amazing posters and lightning talks that we have at this year's conference. The in-person posters can be found outside in the Rongomatane foyer, and the digital posters are available on the iPRES website. There are QR codes for voting on the tables behind the poster area by the windows. So what's on the agenda today? Following our keynote and morning tea break, we have 6 paper sessions, 7 birds of a feather discussions, and of course, the great digital preservation bake-off. Our first bake-off sessions will be virtual demonstrations, followed by 2 helpings of in-person bakers tempting us with their amuse-bouche and tasting spoon creations. We also have a couple of excellent panels engaging cloud providers in digital preservation and regional perspectives on DigiPres. And if all of that wasn't enough, we have an informal National Libraries and Archives meetup and also the Game of Locks. Tonight is also our conference dinner, being held at the banquet hall of Parramatta Aotearoa New Zealand Parliament, inside the famed Beehive, which is the round building you can see on the slide. So please be prepared to go through metal detectors when you arrive. Parliament is about a 20 to 25-minute walk from Tākina. There's also buses and other transport options that you can take if you choose. And it's especially fitting that tonight's conference dinner is being held in the banquet hall of Parliament because that space does, in fact, have a digital preservation connection. In 2004, the National Digital Heritage Archive in 2004, the National Library of New Zealand began its National Digital Heritage Archive project, which is the foundation for our current digital preservation program. In 2006, the library formed a development partnership to build a digital archive and preservation management system, which resulted in Rosetta, and Rosetta went live in October 2008. And the photo on the slide shows the NDHA launch event at the Banquet Hall of Parliament in February 2009. So it's really exciting for us as the digital preservation community to be coming back to that same space tonight. And this is the part where Andrea regrets that she gave me a speaking slot. Before we move into the heart of day two, I want to take a moment and acknowledge our conference chair, Andrea Goethals, for her leadership in bringing all of this together. She has been calm and methodical, and honestly, it's been a privilege to work alongside her. Andrea has had a clear vision to take the best elements and learning of iPRES conferences past, but also to infuse this year's event with what makes Aotearoa New Zealand and the wider Pacific region so very special. Andrea sewed all of the lanyards that we are wearing herself, so that way everybody would have something handmade to take away from this conference. And not to give anything away, but we're going to see more of her sewing later today as well at the bake-off. And all of this was on top of managing the digital preservation program for National Library and Archives New Zealand during a major organizational restructure. You know, no big deal. But of course, conferences are a team effort, and I have to say we have truly had the dream team, with Wellington staff from Library and Archives, the Tonga Sound and Vision, Te Papa, and more all involved in the planning and delivery of this year's conference. I'd also like to acknowledge the Australasia Preserves community for your enthusiasm and support, the work of the Regional Impact Committee, who have been working tirelessly to ensure that local communities can benefit from iPRES having been held here. And another big thank you to Dale Cousins, our cultural advisor, who has been with us from the very start of the planning of the conference and was so generous in sharing her time and knowledge with us to weave Māori culture throughout. We could not have made this conference what it is without you, and I am so grateful. Ngā mihi kia koe. And thank you as well to our accessibility advisor, Blanche Joslin, the volunteers on the care team who are making sure that all attendees are supported in their well-being, and all of our session volunteers from Archives and National Library. We also have online volunteers from the National Archives of Australia who are helping to field your questions in Slack. It truly takes a village. And of course, thank you to our sponsors and our vendors who make events like this possible. We could not do it without them, and please do make sure to have a chat to them during the breaks. And finally, because I've been going on for a while now and I'm not even the good part of the day, thank you to all of you. I am continually amazed and impressed by the dedication of the iPRES community and the fact that so many of you have been involved in the planning along the way. Many folks who weren't actually able to be here themselves still participated in that planning process. And I find that really amazing and extraordinary as well. These are still disruptive times, to call back to the iPRES2023 theme in Illinois, and coming together like this as a community is truly nourishing, and I'm so glad that we're able to do so both in person and online. From me and my colleagues at the National Library and Archives and the regional and global team working to organize this year's iPRES, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for making the journey. Thank you for tuning in online. We've put our full hearts into this year's conference, and we hope that it leaves you feeling inspired, connected, and open to new ways of thinking. Yesterday, we got to experience Haerenga, the journey, both figurative and literal. For day 2 of our conference, we are focusing on Tūtaki, encounter. And this theme is focused on innovation, disruption, reevaluation of long-held norms, and explorations of how we can adapt in changing times. And there is no one better to get the conversation started on day 2 than our keynote speaker, Rosalyn Metz. Rosalyn Metz is a thought leader in library museum technology, serving as Chief Technology Officer at Emory University Libraries and Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. Rosalyn is known for her fearless perspectives on politics, power, and the sustainability of open infrastructure and the scholarly community. Her career spans roles at Stanford University, George Washington University, and Wheaton College, as well as industry experience in project management and software training. She has held leadership positions in Fedora, Samvera, AP Trust, and is a member of OCFL Editors. She is also the author of a weekly newsletter, the Digital Shift Digest, which explores how technology is transforming libraries, cultural heritage, and higher education. Today's keynote, Encountering Collapse, Power, Community, and the Future of Infrastructure, is sure to challenge and spur us to action. No mai haere mai. A warm welcome to you, Rosalyn. The stage is yours.
Hello, everybody. First, I just want to thank everyone for having me today. I was really excited when I saw the email asking me if I would present a keynote for this conference. I was in Canada with my family at the time, and my Auntie Lynn, who actually is a librarian, she's my husband's aunt, but she's my Auntie Lynn. She lives in Australia and used to be a community organizer and a labor organizer in Australia as a librarian. So she thought this was amazing. So I'm really, really excited to be here because I really love this conference. So today we're going to talk about, as Val said, encountering collapse. We often treat infrastructure as stable, neutral, and purely technical, but it never has been. In many societies, particularly those shaped by shared governance or collective values, infrastructure has consistently reflected and reinforced deeper structures, including community, accountability, and shared responsibility. Today, those structures are eroding globally. What happens when community is no longer a given? When open infrastructure is exploited? When does resilience become a human and technical challenge? In my talk today, I'm going to examine 4 arguments through the lens of Tūtaki, one of the iPRES2025 themes. First, I'll argue that infrastructure is never neutral. It encodes power and prioritize specific interests. Second, I'll highlight the often overlooked role of community as the backbone of open infrastructure. Third, I'll interrogate the limits of openness, showing how exploitation and privatization threaten the integrity of our shared ecosystem. And then fourth, I'll invite us to learn from institutional and technological collapse, not as failure, but as opportunity. Encountering infrastructure as a political and cultural act allows us to view collapse not as an endpoint, but as a movement when new ecosystems begin to emerge. Across networks and communities, we can already observe the emergence of a more participatory, people-centered infrastructure that reflects shared values rather than imposed control. By recognizing these patterns and intentionally nurturing them, we create the conditions for a more resilient, connected, and hopeful future. So before we get started, I love this. Before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about myself so that you would know who I am, because not all of you have had the opportunity to encounter me yet. So the first thing I just want you all to know is I'm American. Surprise. That really does shape how I see the world and the technology that we build. My perspective is framed by national narratives in the US that I sometimes try to resist, but usually fail. I will also say that I am shaped by the fact that I live and have spent the majority of my life in the southern part of the United States. After growing up in New England, I've learned that place profoundly influences how we understand each other. One of the things I appreciate about the South is its willingness to name uncomfortable truths, like its history with racism. That regional honesty has taught me the importance of being open and honest, something that I try to carry into my work with technology, but also my work as a leader. The second thing I want you to know is that I've spent much of my career immersed in open infrastructure. So I've worked on lots of projects, which we talked about earlier, but I've also worked on other open projects that some people would probably be surprised about, such as Moodle. That was actually my very first open source project that I was ever participating in, and Drupal. But I've also done quite a bit of community organizing over the years, although I didn't know at the time that that's what it's called, but yeah, I do some community organizing. And I like to help people connect and collaborate and learn from one another. Over time, I've seen communities evolve in countless ways, and I find that work really inspiring, but also really messy. And we'll talk about some of the messiness today. Finally, the last thing I want you to know about me is I love political philosophy. I'm a true political philosophy junkie. In college, I wanted to major in philosophy, and my dad told me that was more useless than his English degree. So I did not major in philosophy. I majored in political science because I thought it was going to be really helpful for my future career as a lawyer. You can see how well that's working out for me. I actually ended up minoring in philosophy, and I think a lot of people think that political science is like current events because, that's what you read about in the news, but really political science is about the study of governance and how power and control persists within society. Political philosophy takes that a step further and really thinks about the philosophies that infuse power and control into society. I also want to just preface this with my degree was really focused on Western philosophy because point number 1, I'm American. We're bad about that sort of thing. So I'm sharing all of this with you because I think it's essential for you to know where I come from and why I'll raise the ideas and the examples that I do throughout this talk, because I'm a librarian if you hadn't heard. I really like examples and I like to quote things. And I really want to dive into the first argument, but before I do that, I also want to say all of these views are my own. And I think that is important for Americans to now say in their talks. So none of my views here are reflected on my university. Yeah, we're there. So the first thing I want to do is ask the question, if infrastructure is never neutral, if it encodes power, and it reflects the choices about whom and what to support, which values do we ascribe to, and which relationships do we sustain? Oh, I got to point over here, okay. The first person that I want to talk about for infrastructure is Hannah Arendt. If you don't know who Hannah Arendt is, she was a German-born American political theorist and philosopher. She was best known for her work on totalitarianism and evil. She was forced to flee Nazi Germany as a Jewish refugee during World War II, and her experiences heavily influenced her most famous books, which are The Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is where the term the banality of evil comes from. Her work examines power and authority and the human condition, and I first learned about her in college in one of my political science classes called Evil. I took a course on evil. It was the coolest course. In Home to Roost, a bicentennial address, Arendt argues that the political, moral, and institutional crises facing the United States in the 1970s, specifically the Vietnam War and Watergate, were not isolated incidents. Instead, they were the cumulative result of a more profound corruption of political reality that placed a greater emphasis on image making, which she called image making, and denial. Now, I know what you're thinking, why are you talking about this? We're supposed to be talking about infrastructure. But I really do promise you, I have a point. So Arendt argues that the strife we saw in the United States in the 1970s was driven by the rise of what is now known and commonly referred to as public relations. And most of you probably aren't aficionados of public relations, I don't know. But most of the thoughts around public relationships can actually be, or public relations can actually be traced back to Freud. So if you don't know, his nephew, his name was Edward Bernays, actually invented the profession of public relations back in the 1920s. The reason that smoking is subversive is because Edward Bernays had women who were fighting for the right to vote, march down the streets of, I think, New York City, smoking a cigarette. And that was the beginning of how he tied emotions to products. And there you go. I have links. You can watch the documentary. So the Vietnam War, in Arendt's view, exposed how deeply that concept of public relations and image making redefined the US. The war wasn't fought for territory or freedom, but to preserve America's image as the mightiest power on earth. That pursuit hollowed out the government's moral judgment. It turned into the machinery of war, so that things like the bureaucracy, the media reports, the data pipelines of progress reports and body counts, all into this infrastructure that denied the war and how it was actually going. So by replacing truth and understanding with image, the US government allowed citizens to become alienated from one another and from the shared reality that sustained political life. And this picture that I have up here is actually from something called the Hard Hat Riots in New York City, which I had never heard of, but this is what happens in the US when you leave PBS on as your permanent, when you turn on the TV, you end up sucked into some documentary on the Hard Hat Riots. But essentially it was a riot between students who were protesting the war and construction workers who felt like their sons were going off to die in the war. And it's interesting because they both were on the same side. But the ideas that permeated society sort of forced them into this conflict with one another. Arendt's, in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, Hannah Arendt identified a different form of infrastructural power too. She identified the power to forget. Now, for those of you who may not know about the Watergate, it started on June 17th, 1972, and it was when Richard Nixon, former president of the United States, his 1972 re-election campaign broke into the opposing party, the Democrats' National Committee offices, and implanted bugging devices, and then moved into the hotel across the street. That was their plan, but they got caught. What ended up happening was Richard Nixon was removed from he was impeached from the presidency. He drove off into the sunset, so to speak. And what happened afterwards was lots of calls for amnesty and let's move on and let's forget what has happened here. And Hannah Arendt saw a lot of similar discussions around forgetting what Richard Nixon had done with what had happened in Germany during World War II. And that's something that she discusses at length in Eichmann in Jerusalem. To Arendt, forgetting became a way of maintaining order through selective memory. Arendt's warning about the erosion of truth feels eerily contemporary. Our modern media, driven by social media algorithms, decides what is discussed and what is obscured. The infrastructure that shapes our digital lives doesn't just transmit information, it defines what we recognize as trustworthy. And that brings us to the World Economic Forum's work on digital trust, which tries to codify the very values that Arendt talks about in her work into the technology that we build. I will also say it's very ironic that I'm quoting the World Economic Forum about trust because they are seen as a group of political elites. But it's a really great report. You should read it. So like Arendt, the World Economic Forum's report emphasizes that infrastructure is never neutral. Every technology decision reflects the values that are prioritized and those that are overlooked. The World Economic Forum urges all leaders, not just technology leaders, all leaders, to decide and act for digital trust. It acknowledges that trust is not solely a product of innovation, but it is also shaped by the governance choices made by the entire organization. As comprehensive as this framework is, it risks giving the impression that trust can be engineered through structure and compliance, but that's not what they're arguing. What has become increasingly clear, however, is that trust is not only something we build into technology, it is something we choose to practice. When we decide what counts as secure, who has access, how data moves, we're not just engineering infrastructure, we're engineering trust. The report also surfaces that when oversight is absent, power consolidates, and we especially see this in the United States, where technology regulation has been sparse at the national level. Most of it happens at the state level, which ultimately allows power to consolidate in a handful of companies who I don't need to name, but just for fun: Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta. And also, what a strange world we live in where now Microsoft is like the kind of docile company in the room. It's so strange. But when technologies are built with clear accountability, power begins to flow differently, and individuals and communities can regain agency. What the report calls inclusive, ethical, and responsible use is really an argument for rebalancing power so we can create space for these 8 dimensions that are up on the screen. Neutrality in this view is not possible because choosing to build infrastructure without valuing these 8 dimensions is in and of itself a political act. The digital trust framework reflects the political influences embedded in our technologies while outlining a path toward infrastructure that prioritizes accountability and inclusion. When I first wrote this talk, I didn't include any examples, and then I realized, like, you're not in a college course, so I really should probably give you some fun examples. So I've created a section that I like to call story time after each one of my arguments. So the first story that I want to tell is about artificial general intelligence. So I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, likely know that AI is scraping content on the internet. A big part of this is that AI companies need the content to help develop large language models, the type of AI most companies are focusing on these days. I have a slide here that you can read that kind of shows how LLMs function, the process of tokenization, and I also have some references of like YouTube videos that will explain this in detail. I did a presentation for a class, and I just really love this slide now. Suffice it to say, LLMs are, for all intents and purposes, a statistical model. So the more data it has, the more accurate it can be about what text comes next. So lots of organizations are developing large language models with the express goal of achieving artificial general intelligence. If you're not familiar with AGI, it can be defined as AI systems that match or exceed the human brain in terms of complexity and speed, capable of acquiring, manipulating, and reasoning with general knowledge. That was the definition assigned by somebody in 1997. It still holds today. You will frequently hear organizations like OpenAI remark on their goals of artificial general intelligence, about successfully achieving this technology to have the potential to enhance humanity and increase abundance and accelerate the global economy and assisting in the uncovering of new scientific knowledge. And it sounds so fantastic. But what does it all mean? Because honestly, it kind of sounds like some AI slop. But as someone who was tired of hearing about AI, I would say about at the beginning of 2024, I was kind of ignoring them because they were annoying. And then one day, while I was sitting in my car, because I am a mom and we like to sit in our cars and hide from our family, I came across an Instagram reel about the TESCREAL bundle. And I thought, is this fake? Like, is this like one of those weird, like internet social media conspiracy theories? And so I'm a librarian and I Googled and did some research and went looking for something more on this bundle that people were talking about. Also, never believe everything you see on social media, friends. And that's when I discovered Dr. Gabru and Dr. Torres's paper in the journal First Monday. In the article, they posit that AGI is not a neutral technological movement, but rather a revival of eugenic, colonial, and supremacist worldviews. The philosophies that make up what is called the TESCREAL bundle, a term that they coined, are transhumanism, extropianism, singularity, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. These intertwined belief systems perpetuate hierarchies of human value, positioning wealthy technologists as moral stewards of humanity's future, while obscuring the social, political, and ecological harm that their technologies do. It's also really fun. I know there's like a thing on here. I'm not as cool as the guy yesterday. But you can actually watch some of the individuals like move through the different philosophies. What's his last name? Eli Yudkowsky, he just released a book. You can listen to him on all the podcasts. And I like to walk around my neighborhood and like yell at podcast hosts for giving him airtime, but that's neither here nor there. I knew many of the people involved in striving toward AGI seemed to know each other. I used to live in Silicon Valley. It's not a very big place. They all had kind of questionable morals, I'm not gonna lie. You know, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, they were buddy-buddy. They created PayPal. I still don't have a PayPal account. And I kind of dismissed the connections, and then I started, because I'm a political philosophy junkie, I actually started reading about some of these philosophies, and I was like, holy, are you crazy? This is insane. Anyway, so the key players discussed in the paper, I started reading all about them, and I was like, whoa, you are really all connected. And then I was totally validated when Cade Metz, who's a reporter for the New York Times, no relation, I wish, he released an article recently in the New York Times about, it was like titled, Silicon Valley's New Techno-Religion, and it was all about the effective altruism movement and how it's kind of gotten a little creepy, and they have like a house together, and it's just weird. It's just weird. So Dr. Gabru and Dr. Torres reminded me that when I hear promises of abundance and progress and salvation all through technology, I should pause and ask, whose abundance? Whose progress? Whose salvation? Recognizing that infrastructure is never neutral, invites us into a deeper encounter with the technologies we've built, asking not only what kind of world they sustain, but what kind of world we create through them. This encounter compels us to confront how truth, memory, and value are encoded into our infrastructure. If neutrality is a myth, then how do we make our values visible in the infrastructure we design? To build infrastructure with integrity means acknowledging that every technical decision carries weight. It means refusing the comfort of apolitical progress and encountering the discomfort of accountability. Our challenge is not simply to preserve bits, but to preserve the capacity for truth and collective memory in technologies that increasingly flatten, filter, and forget. The question is no longer whether technology will shape the future, it's whether we'll have the courage to shape technology's intention. So my next argument is community is the backbone of ecosystems. And we've talked about the myth of infrastructure's neutrality. And if that is true, what does it mean for the communities that surround the infrastructures we have developed? Resilience is not inherent in technologies. It comes from the people who maintain them. Ask anybody who's ever worked on a server. And the activities they engage in to ensure resilience. Open infrastructure communities emerge when individuals encounter like-minded people and form communities with the idea that together they will share responsibility for that ecosystem. Technology may provide the scaffolding for why communities come together, but without the relational bonds that hold it together or hold it up, even the most advanced technologies will falter. Elinor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, offers insights particularly relevant to today's digital world. Through her research on fisheries, forests, and irrigation networks, Ostrom illustrates that communities can effectively manage common pool resources. For those of you who did not have to take economics in college or anywhere, common pool resources are defined as shared resources that are both non-excludable, meaning it is difficult to prevent individuals from using those resources, like air. I could, but we're not gonna go there. You all can use the air, right? And rivalrous, indicating that one person's use of it reduces the resource for others. So you can think about something like water, technically air too, I guess is rivalrous. Before Ostrom's work, scholars generally believed that such resources could be managed only by private companies or by state-controlled governments. Ostrom revealed a third approach, which is community governance. What came out of Governing the Commons was her 8 design principles, which I've listed here. These design principles became a mechanism for building trust among communities seeking to govern common pool resources. Ostrom's framework offers valuable insights for open infrastructure, which many argue is non-excludable and a rivalrous. Her design principles mirror the challenges that we often see within our own open infrastructure communities, especially when we are trying to manage shared software and shared standards. Ostrom believed that the common pool resources are strengthened when the people who depend on them invest in one another, and you can see that in these 8 design principles. They're really more about how people interact with one another. As a postscript, toward the end of Ostrom's career, she began to engage more actively with the scholarly communications community. She would attend symposiums and workshops, and she also co-edited a book called Understanding Knowledge as a Commons, From Theory to Practice. Her contributions are also significant to Nadia Asparova's work on open infrastructure, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So Ostrom's 8 design principle helps us see how a community might govern itself, but let's discuss how Wheatley and Fries talk about how communities form. So in their work, using emergence to take social innovation to scale, They argue that lasting and large-scale social change does not come from a top-down control or mass mobilization. Instead, it arises from the self-organizing dynamics of living ecosystems. According to Wheatley and Fries, local initiatives connect to form networks, which then evolve into communities of practice. And this process ultimately leads to the creation of new ecosystems of influence through something called emergence. The phenomenon where new and complex properties or behaviors develop from the interactions of simpler components within an ecosystem. Instead of striving for critical mass, the idea that widespread adoption follows once all individuals are on board and they come together, what Wheatley and Fries argue is that change agents should cultivate connections among people. The relationships generate shared learning, trust, and mutual commitment, which are necessary for transformation. Their model of emergence mirrors what happens when a single piece of software written by someone to solve a problem matures into something more. At first, people connect out of sheer curiosity, or they're complaining about something that already exists, which is a fine way to connect. Over time, those relationships evolve into communities where people will experiment together, share lessons learned, and start shaping standards and software. That's when software becomes something more, like open infrastructure. The community around it becomes strong enough to sustain it, and technology provides the scaffolding, but people supply the structure's integrity. What Wheatley and Fries make clear is that resilience shows up when relationships do. When local scattered efforts begin to connect, something larger takes shape. Something with its own momentum. The technology may change over time, but the relationships that hold the work together are what needs to endure. So now I'm going to do a story time that's going to very much disappoint my friend Neil Jeffries, because I said that I might try to talk about Deepin, but I'm not that brave. So we're going to talk about how Fedora almost collapsed. When I really think about how communities can come together, I really do think about Fedora. I think what happened with Fedora 4, and if you're not aware, back in 2014, there was work done to introduce some new innovative ways to use Fedora. They put linked data support in, they reimagined the architecture, they made the storage something that was handled by another piece of software, and it was all very ambitious, and everybody thought it was going to be innovative and great. But ultimately, though, that is not what happened. The migration path from Fedora 3 to Fedora 4 was arduous, to say the least. I'm looking at Mark, he's like, yeah. And many institutions chose not to attempt it, leaving so many people stranded on version 3. There are actually still people out there that are on version 3 and a handful of people who are on version 2. I don't know what's up with that, but yeah, it's there. For institutions maintaining massive collections, it was devastating. It was not something anybody wanted to do, and the tensions within the community, like you could cut it with a knife. It was so thick. What we noticed was that the community's confidence in Fedora was really starting to wane. And for a while, some of us in the Fedora community thought the project might die. I personally was like terrified because I was the chair of Fedora at the time, and it was like during the COVID period, so I got to be chair extra long, and I was like, oh God, this is gonna die and it's all gonna be blamed on me. So some of us in that community started to think about, like, what do we do? How do we wind down this community that had been around for 20 plus years? That sense of near death became a catalyst for change. During the Fedora Samvera camp in Oxford, UK, two people, Andrew Hankinson, who worked at Oxford at the time, and Andrew Woods, who was the tech lead for Fedora at the time, started discussing the problem in a productive manner, because I will say not all the criticism was productive. They together came up with an initial proposal that directly addressed the challenges the community was raising around Fedora and the migration problems. And the proposal called for an application-agnostic approach to long-term file preservation. Later that year, there was a longer paper that circulated incorporating extensive community comments, my own included, which every once in a while I regret. I'm just kidding, Neil. And from these efforts, the Oxford Common File layout emerged in 2017. And it's used heavily to this day. OCFL didn't just fix a technical problem, it also helped us that were stewarding Fedora repair the relationships between Fedora and the community. Fedora's governance groups had to confront the mistakes of the past directly. Many of us actually were not involved in those decisions around Fedora 4, but yet we had to admit we made a mistake. We wrote a white paper laying out a new vision for Fedora, committing to transparency and inviting the community back in. We started holding listening sessions, which we actually still do to this very day, with different communities, allowing them to sign up and engage with us and tell us what's going on. They also applied, and I put this on David Wilcox really, for a grant to address the migration problem. David was the community manager at the time. And of course, we adopted OCFL, allowing it to address the issues that a lot of people were having and with the opaque storage layer that was making migrations really difficult. We didn't bounce back overnight, but we did do it through the hard work of community and community building and recreating trust with the institutions that were using Fedora. We actually, in one of our community listening sessions, we had a person say they had just finished their migration off of Fedora, and if they had realized when we started to talk about OCFL that we were going to go to OCFL, they probably wouldn't have done the migration. So in some respects, that was very validating. I mean, sad, but validating. But I will say that when I look back at that time period, it's not really the technical work, but the work that Fedora's community members did to repair and build trust that really stands out to me. Admitting failure is important. Facing criticism head on, even when it's less than, constructive. It really helped us turn an unhealthy environment into a more healthy one. So governance, according to Ostrom's framework, serves as the foundation for emergence that Wheatley and Fries describe. It creates a trust-based structure that fosters collaboration and creativity by clearly defining boundaries, responsibilities, and accountability mechanisms. In this way, effective governance does not stifle innovation. Instead, it provides the necessary structure for it to thrive. This shared sense of agency builds legitimacy and fosters a sense of belonging. At the same time, governance ensures that systems remain adaptable. When people have the autonomy to adapt rules to local communities, the system as a whole becomes better able to learn and respond to change. This adaptability fuels emergence. Small experiments ripple through a network. They create new patterns of collaboration. And in short, governance creates the clarity and accountability that allows communities to move from coordination to emergence. So communities enable the creation of infrastructure, but our values are what shape it. As a profession, we commit each day to making knowledge freely accessible. However, when this commitment becomes routine or we share information without considering our motivations, we risk confusing the democratization of information with the potential exposure of the communities that we serve. So in my next argument is openness has limits. And here's where I get like super radical for a group of librarians. Libraries often talk about openness as a core tenet of our belief system. For many organizations, making knowledge publicly available isn't a question. We just do it. But we have embedded openness into our core belief system that leaves the idea without governance. So here we all are being like, yay, openness. But should we say yay, openness? The AI era has revealed the challenge associated with openness. What was intended to democratize knowledge now risks benefiting exploitative companies that are far from neutral, as I talked about previously. This means creating environments where agreement, governance, and collaboration guide our participation. Genuine openness supports the commons through shared responsibility rather than through indiscriminate exposure. So the first article I'm going to talk about is Catherine Skinner. If you don't know Catherine Skinner, she was at Educopia and is now at Invest in Open Infrastructure. She's a fantastic person to get to know. She also really likes like fairy tale type stories. I'm going to talk about her other article later. So in The Emperor's New Clothes, Catherine Skinner reminds us that openness on its own is not a virtue. Without governance, without the frameworks that create accountability, openness quickly turns into exploitation. She calls out the illusion, which, you know, that's what the Emperor's New Clothes out, the illusion that they're wearing clothes. The illusion we've built around open infrastructure, around progress and equity. What we call open often masks hidden hierarchies, unpaid labor, and decisions made behind closed doors. Skinner's analysis of funding patterns exposes how this imbalance plays out. We celebrate grant announcements. They're great, they're fantastic. New features, awesome, amazing, but rarely questions how the underlying infrastructure stays afloat or who is asked to hold it up. As she points out, most funding goes toward visible innovation rather than the invisible work of maintenance and community building. That's the paradox of our current ecosystem. It rewards novelty while depleting the ecosystem that makes openness possible in the first place. I will say, like, when I meet somebody new who's like in charge of a community, I will ask them, how are you doing? Because oftentimes they are tired, very, very tired. The alternative that Skinner sketches out in her piece are less about control and more about stewardship. She points to models like iPRES that builds openness through shared governance and pooled investment. iPRES has done a really great job of making sure that their employees are paid and they're paid fairly. I mean, we could argue, but you know. It's all dependent on where you live. These ecosystems don't confuse access with equity. Instead, they recognize that sustainable openness requires structure and agreement among all who participate. In Skinner's framing, governance keeps communities from burning out or being exploited. If we want openness to endure, we have to treat it as a relationship that needs to be tended, not a product to be consumed. Over the last few years, I've noticed that sharing alone doesn't guarantee equity or sustainability. For me, the ideals of openness have collided with reality. The systems that promise collaboration and shared progress can, without governance, reproduce the exact same hierarchies that we're trying to dismantle. So let's talk about Nadia Asparova. She wrote the report for the Ford Foundation and another foundation, which really talked about roads and bridges and how open infrastructure is open infrastructure. So we've long celebrated transparency and access as the cornerstone of innovation, But Asperova forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that open infrastructure often disguises exploitation. Roads and bridges are built by maintainers who are underpaid, if they are paid at all, overextended and largely unseen. Meanwhile, the companies and institutions that rely on their work, like Google, Meta, Amazon, reap these rewards without having to pay a dime. What we call freedom in open infrastructure often hides structural neglect. The same openness that powers collaboration also permits exploitation when recognition and consent aren't part of the equation. The call that emerges from roads and bridges is for a new kind of openness, one that balances labor with acknowledgement. Asperova asks us to stop equating open infrastructure with virtue and start designing for durability. We need funding models that honor maintenance, institutions that share in the responsibility, and communities that consent to the load they carry. In other words, the future of openness depends on recentering the value of labor. If exploitation is what happens when openness runs without governance, then sustainability, real long-term sustainability, begins when we practice openness while valuing the labor itself. So I want to talk about the impact of AI on labor, but not in the way that people normally talk about it, right? They talk about how people's jobs are going to go away, et cetera, et cetera. What I've noticed is the impact of AI on labor for our people today. So my own staff has experienced quite a bit of overwork related to AI bots scraping our content. So this diagram here, or this chart here, is actually our incoming requests by bots coming in trying to scrape our content. We noticed back in mid-2024 that this was on the rise, and that we were having more and more system outages across all of our different systems. At the same time, they're coming in, they're scraping our content, and then they're taking that content and selling licenses for $20 a month. You too can have a license to ChatGPT. But as you can see here, which again, I can't use the thing, login is I'm not logged in. And if I construct the right prompt, I can get our content from Emory University in ChatGPT. So they have taken all of our work for thousands of years. Think about all the people who have come before us, and they have monetized it, and they never asked. But to be fair, we never talked about it. We always want to express openness, and we always want to say openness is good. But is it good? Is this okay? Is it all right for them to take what they've taken and to monetize it? Should we have conversations about whether or not openness matters? Should everything be open? So responsible openness looks like, in a world focused on exploitation, reconsidering that openness, thinking about whether or not we should be more thoughtful, or if we should just allow everything to be open. When I look at my own institution's collections, we have a lot of collections from the Black experience in America, but we're a predominantly white institution. Who are we to say whether or not, by allowing that collection of it to be available to everyone, we're not actually inflicting more harm than we are good? And even when we are capable of doing that, like making those good decisions because we know those communities super, super well, like our own university, we're still not having those conversations. Is openness good? The last thing I want to talk about is collapse. Collapse is not the end. Moments when ecosystems show their worth and create room for renewal is a moment for all of us to be able to think about what are the values, what are the things that we want to make new. As an American, this is a very important point for me to think about because I'm pretty sure my government is on the verge of collapse, which is, you talk to your American friends, they're not doing well. There are two individuals or two articles that I really want to point to. One is an article from Paradigm Blindness to Paradigm Shift. I'm going to slaughter the last name, so I'm just not going to do it. And this talks about the cycle of paradigm blindness, how we are blind to see what we aren't able to see, right? The things you don't know that you don't know. But that over time, by engaging with one another and seeing the world and thinking about the world, the veil lifts and we can suddenly see the true world that we live in. And here you can really see a lovely metaphor for the United States of America. The authors, however, when they talk about paradigm blindness and regeneration, one of the things they warn is that you can actually get stuck in a loop of regeneration, thinking that it's normal, thinking that this weirdness, this strange experience that you're experiencing is perfectly fine. Again, check on your American friends. But we can see this in our own communities where we will often just keep doing something because we have always done it. The last article is Catherine Skinner's The Red Queen's Race. She suggests that ecosystems should look like for libraries in this article. Instead of saying that we should create more open ecosystems and more open source software, she says that basically all of these things are running in place as fast as they can, kind of like Alice in Wonderland and the Red Queen's Race. She lists out 7 different interlocking causes for this, which are here on the screen. And together, these structural weaknesses create a cycle in which open community-based initiatives must constantly reinvent themselves to remain visible and relevant, yet rarely achieve the financial or organizational stability needed for durability. And what she's suggested, and I think part of the reason, although I can't speak for her, that she's at IOI is that she believes that we need to do more to work together in these communities. That by working together, we can really create something greater than just one community. So I'm sure my friend, the timekeeper, is panicking because, wait, don't you have a story? You only have 1 minute left. But luckily, I picked the choose your own adventure stories, which were great as a kid. So I would say, how do we as a community encounter collapse? Higher education, scholarly communication, and cultural heritage are undervalued in present-day society. We've been working tirelessly to convince the world that preserving truth and memory and our collective cultural heritage is important. It's almost humorous how many times I've had conversations with people who have this brilliant idea about how to preserve something, only to turn around and tell them, yeah, we already did that in libraries, like over here. Do you want the documentation? I have it. You can use it. So what if we stopped doing that? What if we changed the way we encounter one another and our profession? What if we tried something new? What if we started by designing our own ending? If we could tear down the organizations that we have built, what would we want to get rid of? How would we reimagine our profession today and our organizations? Would we follow the pattern of emergence and regeneration? Could we encounter collapse not from a place of fear, but a place from excitement and anticipation for what is next? What would it mean to design endings that invite both encounter and renewal? Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Rosalyn. You've given us a lot to think about, and the questions are starting to roll in. The first question for you is actually your own question, turned back to you.
Ah!
What is your suggestion for balancing openness with maintaining control over our digital collections?
So I'm going to put on my glasses because I can't, it's too dim in here. I can't see anything when it's dim. So we actually had a collection. It's called the Langmuir African American Collection. It was the one that I was showing in ChatGPT. One of the things within that collection is it's a photographic collection of the Black American experience. It's a large collection of photographs, and there are some very graphic photographs in there, including photographs of lynchings. And one of the things that we had to do was have a conversation about, are we just going to allow that to go out there so that anybody can see it? You can imagine like scrolling and suddenly coming across that is like in search results. That would be extremely disturbing. So we've made sure that that stuff is locked behind login. We're not stopping people from using it, but we don't want people to just come across it, because that would be just not something that we want people to just experience. I wish that we had those conversations about all of our collections. Is this something that we want out there? Is this something that we want to make available for everything? Because like I said before, I think some of the collections that we have are not really our collections to make those decisions about. And I would love to be able to engage in conversations with donors now that we're in the age of AI. Look, I will also say that professors are going through this too, right? They wrote these articles. They're there in, the ChatGPT, Claude, wherever they go looking for them. There's also the Wiley and Perplexity deal, where Wiley has made it so that you can ask questions about Wiley journals if you're in Perplexity. All of that, none of these professors agreed to, right? And their content is out there and is training these large language models, and nobody asked. Nobody asked if this was okay. There's a really great article that was released today, I don't know how you want to look at it, in The Atlantic at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. On Tuesday, November 4th, in The Atlantic about Common Crawl and how Common Crawl is behaving within this space, because most of these AI companies are getting their training data from the Common Crawl. And what the Atlantic article, which I listened to this morning because my husband sent it to me because he loves to show he's as big of a nerd as I am. What I listened to today, the journalist is basically claiming Common Crawl never removed the New York Times articles from the New York Times, from their data sets. They're all still there. They just say they're not in the index. And that means everybody's content is still there, even when you ask to remove. So, I mean, we have to have a conversation about this. Like, at what point do they ask permission to take our stuff, to take our labor, to take our work? I think it's happening to everybody on the internet. And if you want to hear some fun, like arguing about the internet and the what will happen to the future of the internet, I highly recommend the back and forth between this, I think it's the CEO of Perplexity and the CEO of Cloudflare. They don't like each other. It's fun. They were on, the New York Times has a podcast called The Common Fork, or something like that, and something about forking. And they both of them, they were on like a week apart, and one said something bad about the other one during that week, and it was just fascinating. Get your popcorn out while you're listening to that. So,
Thank you. And this next question, you can say no if you don't want to answer it, but if you're willing to go there, what can we learn about the collapse of Deepin?
Did Neil put that in? Oh, yeah. Oh, you're over there. See, this is what happened. I can't even find Neil. I see him all the time. One of the things that one of the articles that I read talked about is how you can't create community and community structures through a top-down approach. It doesn't work. It just doesn't, right? Creating relationships requires people to get to know each other and to build. And I will say Deepin was very much a top-down approach. And having been in the rooms when much of this was discussed, I know that many of those institutions that were backing Deepin were not necessarily doing it because they felt like it was something they needed. They felt like it was something that other institutions needed. And that's pretty paternalistic. Just gonna say that. Look, I went there. I will say the other thing is Catherine Skinner in her, in the Red Queen's Race, she talks about how we don't give people who are in leadership positions within open communities a lot of knowledge about running financials. And that is another reason that Deepin failed. Because the people, I don't think, really had the expertise for running financials for a nonprofit to look at what was being spent, why it was being spent, how it was being spent in a way that I think any of them would have agreed with. Like, I think if they had known what was happening, they might have pulled the plug a lot sooner. I'll just say that.
Thank you. The next question is about AI. If we consider that those who profit from AI also help sustain the public knowledge infrastructures, including libraries and archives that provide the knowledge AI is built on, what would a fair redistribution model look like? What is your advice to the iPRES community to make this happen?
So there are two efforts that are underway for how to do crawling of the web more fairly. One by the guys who created RSS feeds, and then there is another which I believe Cloudflare is backing, but don't quote me on that because I can't remember things. So these two methods essentially say before you get to crawl a website, you will get some sort of message that says, you have to pay for this if you want it. So right now, and like this is how Common Crawl has managed to crawl websites that are technically behind paywall. When you go to a site, I don't know if you've ever done this because you're like over your free limit, but like you go to a website and you're like, I can see the article like for a hot second. Well, the bots are faster than us and they get to scrape all of that content before the paywall pops up. So they never see the paywall, right? They get the content. It never executes the, I think it's whatever programming language is executing. And so they scrape all that content. That's how they get around the paywalls. They're just better at it than humans are because we have to use a browser. That's really it. If you didn't use a browser too, you could probably get around the paywalls. So the idea is that people would be, or bots would be prompted with you have to pay to crawl, and then website owners would say, let me pay, you have to pay me this much, you have to pay me this much, you have to pay me this much. So like if we wanted the Internet Archive to crawl, we wouldn't make them pay because we're like, it's cool, you're crawling things, we're okay with that, we asked you to crawl it. But OpenAI, no, pay me, $500,000. Seems reasonable. So yeah, I think I would say look into those two things and try to figure out, which one you think is helpful and useful. But at minimum, back the idea that we need to do that sort of work.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question about what an individual could do. So this question is, do you have any examples of ways that an individual who embraces the values and responsibilities of openness can express those values and responsibilities within a wider organization? Are there stepping stones to influencing that mindfulness on a larger scale?
I would say to go back and start to build relationships, because it's when you build those relationships and you come together and you create a bigger voice that people start to listen. That is something that I've found. I mean, it doesn't always work. I'm not going to pretend like it's the answer to everything, but I think together we can solve much more than we can separately. So try to find, I'm thinking back, not just because they're sitting right there, but the 3 women yesterday who presented on the early career experience and how they are building relationships in order to help themselves move forward in their career. I think the same thing is true about issues that we need to advocate for. I also would say that we have advocation organizations in libraries, in museums, in cultural heritage, and they're not focusing hard enough on that work. So together, maybe we could convince them that they should be advocating more. I will say one thing that I was able to do was use relationships, because Google can't crawl our scholarly repositories anymore for Google Scholar, because we're blocking them because they don't identify their Google Scholar block. We just sort of say, I don't know which one of your 50 million bots is crawling for which. And so I used relationships as a way to hopefully get a meeting with somebody at Google. Relationships.
Thank you. There's people very interested about rights and licenses. So this question is, what do you think is the future of rights frameworks, copyright, privacy, cultural rights, etc., when they aren't respected by big tech? What are our responsibilities in the cultural heritage and university communities?
So I've been reading the OpenAI New York Times lawsuit, keeping up with it. And one of the things that occurred to me is the New York Times doesn't actually say what the rights are for individual articles. Like, they have it in their footer, like copyright the New York Times. But like, if I'm a machine and I'm looking at your HTML, I don't really know how you're indicating that the copyright is what the copyright is. And when I did like a quick, do the inspect elements on the New York Times and then like on the Washington Post, which are my 2 major newspapers, I noticed what they do put in there is radically different. Like, they're not doing it the same way. So like, in some sort of defense to OpenAI, how do we indicate what copyright is on a website? Like, how would they know? How is there a machine learning way for them to find that when they're just scraping? And if you don't know, one of the ways that they do scraping is they're actually creating web archives. So they're creating WARCs, and then taking these WARCs, they're putting the text into like sort of plain text. There's a name for it that I can't remember. But like, where will they go to see that this is copyrighted? So I think that's one thing that maybe we could be doing, is trying to push a movement to say this is how you encode copyright within the HTML itself, like within the headers, so that when somebody comes to the site, they know immediately, like, okay, the copyright is, no, you can't crawl this, no, you can't do that. Because at least then the bots can be like, oh, I see it. I mean, maybe they'll still ignore it, I don't know. But it's there.
Kia ora. So that is all of our questions. Thank you so much, Rosalyn. That was a fantastic keynote. I know I certainly have a lot of reading to do now. we have a small gift for you. The waiata that we sang was all about community, and we have a ponamu for you. The ponamu that we have specifically chosen is the punga, or the anchor stone. And the anchor stone was originally used by the explorer Kupe on his voyaging canoe. It represents a steadying influence during rough times. And punga provides security, stability, peace, and strength to endure. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you again, everyone, and please enjoy some morning tea.
Thank you.